Hello, genealogists. This is Craig, and this is Just Genealogy. And today we're going to cover Chapter 6 of that book I've been reading to you, for those of you driving down the road, Genealogy as a Pastime and Profession by Donald Lyons Jacobus, second edition revised. This is published by Genealogical Publishing Company in 1968. The first edition was published in 1930. So beginning with Chapter 6. Royal Ancestry. And there's a quote: "Boast the pure blood of an illustrious race in quiet flow from Lucrece to Lucrece. But by your father's worth, if yours you rate, count me those only who were good and great. Go, if your ancient but ignoble blood has crept through scoundrels ever since the flood. Go, and pretend your family is young, nor own your fathers have been fools so long. How can enable sots or slaves or cowards? Alas, not all the blood of all the Howards." And that's a quote from Pope. Another quote: "Occasional perusals of the genealogical department of the Boston Evening Transcript and other publications having convinced me that, in spite of the fact that all men are created equal, and in spite of the good old American contempt for royalty and the effete nobility of Europe, the American genealogical public have an exceedingly strong desire to deduce their descent by hook or by crook from the same effetes royal and noble houses of Europe. Furthermore, an investigation of these claims usually shows that not 1 in 20 of such pedigrees can stand up under the searching test of modern scientific investigation." That's a quote from G. Andrews Moriarty in the New England Register. And the text continues. "Those of us who trace to the American colonials can work back our ancestral lines for 8 to 12 generations in this country. Then comes a break. Most of the first settlers came from Great Britain or Holland. A large majority were from England. And in this chapter, we shall arbitrarily limit the discussion to those who were from England. Many are satisfied when they have charted their ancestry to the first come-overers, but of late years, more and more interest has been taken in the earlier English ancestry. Genealogical students now wish to be known in what English village their first American ancestor originated, and to carry the line still farther back, if possible. English research is a field in itself, and because of the great difference in conditions, a vast amount of special knowledge is needed before the genealogist is equipped to be an expert or specialist in English research. Some employ English genealogists, while others employ Americans who make periodic trips abroad to arrange or to have the research done by their correspondents there. Since a very large percentage of our colonial ancestors were of yeoman stock or lower grades of society, it is rather difficult to push most lines back more than 3 or 4 generations. For after we get back to the beginning of a parish register's records of the lower social classes are scanty. Mr. J. Gardner Bartlett, one of the foremost specialists in English research, wrote, "Of the 5,000 heads of families who came between 1620 and 1640, less than 50, or not more than 1%, are known to have belonged to the upper gentry of England, and less than 250 more, if not 5%, can be considered as from the minor mercantile or landed gentry. No peers nor sons of peers, no baronets nor their sons, but one knight and no sons of knights were among the founders of New England." To which Mr. Ernest Flagg, in his excellent book, The Founding of New England, adds the following comment: "Yet, if one were to credit the family genealogies, we could conclude that the great majority were of genteel extraction. Sometimes it is only a crest or a coat of arms that is claimed, but very often descent from the most prominent English houses whose surname is the same or similar to their own, and not a few, in all seriousness, claim royal descent. At the public libraries, books purporting to show such connection for American families are fairly worn out by much handling." Among 500 or 1,000 first American ancestors, one can often discover 2 or 3 who did come from the English landed gentry. These lines, because of land ownership, cannot infrequently be followed back for many generations, occasionally to the period of the conquest. But it is never safe to accept, as too many Americans genealogists do, the pedigrees as printed in heralds' visitations and county histories without independent verification from the contemporary documentary sources, many of which are now in print. It sometimes happened that a county gentleman somewhere up the line married a knight's daughter, and by going back on that line, perhaps one of the knights married an earl's daughter, and once we strike the peerage, it is not difficult to acquire some sort of royal ancestry. Just what advantage there is in claiming a fractional drop of royal blood is a complete mystery. For every one descent I might claim from King Alfred, I could claim 1,000,000 from the peasants of his time, if records have been kept of the lower classes. However, if one desires the fun of tracing a long descent, say for 30 generations, it cannot be done unless one succeeds in tapping a royal line. For the farther back we go in the Middle Ages, the scantier the records become, until even royalty itself vanishes in the mists of legend. But if one finds amusement in embarking on this kind of adventure, surely it loses even what little significance it possesses unless care is taken to verify each link in the ancestral chain. For if a single link give way, the royal descent is mere fiction. The credibility of Americans, even of many American genealogists, in matters of this sort is sad to witness. A great impulse is given to the claiming of royal lines by the publication of Browning's book, Americans of Royal Descent. Most of the lines given in this book were not proved by any valid sort of evidence, and a large number of them were false and could readily be disproved. The book passed through several subsequent editions, which corrected some of the errors, but Browning still remains one of the poorest authorities that can be quoted for English ancestry. However, once a line of this sort is put in print, no amount of honest criticism can kill it, and although many of these lines have been disproved again and again, and the evidence printed, the uninformed still continue to quote them. Later, Dr. David Starr Jordan of Your Family Tree disseminated a large number of royal descents, and while he was not personally responsible for the pedigrees given, his name and the minds of many endowed these pedigrees with an authority which they do not merit. In the main, they are copied from the poorest printed sources that could have been selected and are not entitled to credence unless thoroughly verified. It is not generally understood by American genealogists that many of the older European books on royalty and peerage have been superseded by the work of modern scholars in the fields of history and medievalism. Let us first consider the English peerage. The pioneer work on the peerage was Dugdale, which went to original sources for information, but the field was so immense and his facilities so limited that although his baronage remains a standard authority, it must be amplified and corrected from the work of modern scholars. The later peerage writers seldom went to original sources and uncritically accepted much pleasant fiction furnished by members of the families treated, together with many honest mistakes. One peerage writer copied from another, and the result is that Burke's peerage, while a good authority for the period from 1700 to the present, was long a poor authority for the earlier period. And the latter is precisely the period in which Americans of colonial descent are interested. Recent editions, however, have discarded many of the legends and the fictions once included. Modern scholars such as J. Horace Round in Peerage and Family History and other books and articles, and other scholars whose findings have been published in English periodicals such as the Genealogist, have followed Dugdale's example in going to the contemporary documents. And the result has been a new, accurate genealogy based on scientific methods of research. Old fictions have been cast into the discard and many remarkable discoveries made. Another step in the right direction was the publication of the Complete Peerage by G.E. Cocknane. An immense amplified edition of his work, started under the editorship of Gibbs, is now available, and the articles prepared by scholars of repute and containing information that adds immeasurably to our knowledge of English titled families in the Middle Ages. The biographical notices in the Great Dictionary of National Biography are authoritative, though occasionally in need of correction as a result of research done since its publication. The dictionary errs, for one example, in the account in the origin of the House of Mortimer. It is not to be expected that American genealogists would, without years of study and training, decipher the records written in a difficult, abbreviated form of Latin and in medieval French, but they should at least learn what printed authorities can safely be followed, and cease quoting old editions of works on the peerage. When we come to the royal families of continental Europe, American genealogists exhibit an even greater ignorance. Anderson's Royal Genealogy seems to be their favorite source, and this monumental work, published in 1732, is still a reasonably good authority for the period from 1400 to 1700, though notably weak in tracing the royal houses of Russia and the Scandinavian countries. For the earlier period, it follows all the myths and fictions that Anderson found in print, and although he himself cautioned that some of these lines given were probably not historical, they are still copied out and reprinted by the uninitiate. The book is full of inaccuracies regarding even the historical monarchs of France and Germany, especially during the period from 600 to 1100, and should never be used as an authority for this period. Many of the European dynasties were founded by able and unscrupulous upstarts. When established on the throne, they or their successors were flattered by venal genealogists who fabricated long and noble pedigrees for them. A considerable number of these fictitious lines were accepted by the uncritical genealogical students of a former day and repeated in many compilations like that of Anderson. Modern scholars have disproved many of these fictions and have rejected others for lack of proof. Modern scholarship has been busy on the continent, and the results of this research are available in French, German, Spanish, and other tongues at a few of the larger American libraries. It is my sober opinion that American genealogists should not attempt to handle medieval royal genealogy unless they have trained themselves to specialize in this field and are able to read historical works in several languages. Unless they can do this, the best European authorities are sealed books to them. In a field where professional genealogists so often show their ineptitude, the amateur is a lost lamb. In fact, amateurs are responsible for many of the erroneous royal lines that have appeared in print, and once they have originated, they have been copied and reprinted by the type of professional incompetent who believes that the printed word can never lie. A few of these fictionist lines, which I have had occasion to investigate, are mentioned briefly below. The magnificent history of the Henry Whitney family, published by Phoenix in 1878, is marred by the inclusion of a chart purporting to set forth the descent of Henry from the Whitneys of Whitney. Henry's parentage is unknown. The line of descent given is based on two fictitious wills invented by a fraudulent English genealogist and innocently accepted by the compiler. The long-vaunted descent of the Seymour family of Hartford, Connecticut, from the ducal house of Seymour is based on forged entries in a Bible. The forged character of the printing and writing is quite apparent to any genealogist expert in reading the script of the period, and the research of the late J. Gardner Bartlett in England proved conclusively that the American family originated from yeoman stock. The Tuttle family, published in 1883, although the compiler did not profess to know the parentage of the first settler, William Tuttle, nevertheless states that William was the great-great-grandson of William Tothill and Joan Grafton, and then proceeds to trace a royal line through the Graftons. It has since been proved that the American settler came from a different family in England and did not have this Grafton ancestry. A little book entitled By the Name of Rice states that the author has searched in England and found that Deacon Edmund Rice of Sudbury, Massachusetts, was the great-grandson of a Rees who married Catherine Howard, daughter of the second Duke of Norfolk. The evidence was not presented, and it was preposterous on the face of it to believe that good old Deacon Rice was so closely related to the premier dukes of England. On behalf of a client, I've had the claim investigated, and the will of Catherine failed to name the son through whom the descent was claimed. The uncritical are still tracing their ancestry back to all the kings in the deck through the fictitious line. And there's a footnote that says, mention of the Rice claim, as well as of the John Whitney claim on a latter page, is made by kind permission of Mrs. Horatio Ford of South Euclid, Ohio, on whose behalf research has been made by the writer, and by Colonel Charles E. Banks of Boston, Massachusetts. Continuing. The history of the Pomeroy family, compiled by an amateur but in containing the results of research in England by a professional, asserted the descent of the American family from the Pomeroys of Barry Pomeroy. The only real piece of evidence from this claim was a photographic reproduction of an English pedigree, but an inspection of the original pedigree showed that the photograph had been doctored, so that the reproduction contained more data than the original, and precisely the data which was needed to substantiate the claim. The research of Mrs. Elizabeth French Bartlett put a quietus on so much grandiloquent ancestry. The statement has often appeared that the noted Anek Jans of New Amsterdam was the daughter or granddaughter of William the Silent. Some 60 years ago, a descent had the royal arms of the House of Orange painted on her coach. This was triply ridiculous. In the first place, the House of Orange did not become royal until several generations later than William the Silent. Hence, his descendants were not entitled to the royal arms unless members of the royal line. In the second place, William left sons, and no descendants of the female line could be entitled to use arms. Even if he had left no male descendants, the female line would only have been entitled to quarter the arms. Finally, the family of William is well known in a matter of documentary history. Anake could not have descended from him except illegitimately, and in that case could only have used his arms, if at all, with a Ben Sinster. But not a shred of evidence has ever been presented, so far as I'm aware, to back up this absurd claim. It is queer commentary on human nature that people who would be shocked by illegitimacy in an American forebear should be so eager to believe that an ancestor was a bastard of the Prince of Orange. Another dubious line is that of another Whitney immigrant, John of Waterton, Massachusetts. Here a great deal of genuine research was done, and a beautiful book published containing the evidence in full. Unfortunately, the critical link in the pedigree is the identity of Thomas, supposed father of John, with Thomas, son of Robert, third son of Sir Robert Whitney. The only evidence for this identity is a pedigree in the British Museum showing the claim of a later London Whitney to be heir male of the Whitneys of Whitney. The claim was not backed by any evidence, and presumably was mistaken or fraudulent, for a careful analysis of the available dates shows that the generation in the pedigree would have been incredibly short. If correct, the father and son must each have married at the unusual age of 15, and in view of this, the conclusion of the author cannot be accepted without stronger proof than this book presents. These are examples of the royal lines which have generally been accepted by the uncritical, and some of them, I understand, have been accepted by such societies as the Baronial Order of Runnymede and the Order of the Crown. It would seem that there is scarcely an American family for whom some such claim has not been made. There are a few families for whom royal lines can be proved by sound, legitimate evidence. Many of the false claims are so absurd that it is hard to understand how they can deceive any except those who wish to be deceived. That is one of the saddest features of this subject. The capable and honest genealogist too often receives no gratitude for the client for whom he has taken a cherished illusion. Genealogists know this, and this is not surprising if the less scrupulous ones hesitate to deprive the wealthy client of his minutiae of royal blood. And then there's a quote, "But let not this last wish be vain, deceive me once again." And that's Landor. Thank you so very much for joining me today in my reading of Chapter 6 on Royal Ancestry in Genealogy as Pastime and Profession by Donald Lyons Jacobus. And we will talk to you soon.